So once you finish the leg of the sock, you're ready to start the flap, the heel flap. The heel flap is worked on half the stitches of the leg of the sock. And it is worked flat, and that's something that's really important. So once you come to this point, you are ready to work. And we have been working around and around, but now we're going to work flat. So what you do is you get ready to knit, and if you're using the double pointed needles, you're going to knit off the first two needles, and in this case it's 22 stitches because I'm making the 44 stitch version. If you're making a bigger one, obviously your half of your stitches will be larger. So what you're going to do is you're going to get ready with your fifth needle ready to work, and then you are just going to knit across the stitches from needles 1 and 2, and you're going to work those onto one needle. So this is something that I've seen people doing, is you don't have to swap needles, and actually you can remove your marker here as well, just to say that. So what you're doing now is you're working across the stitches off of needle 1 and off of needle 2 onto one single needle. There is no need to work back and forth across two different needles when you're working this part of it. It's just easier to do them on one needle, and if you have double pointed needles that are at least 15 centimeters in length, they're definitely long enough to take all of the stitches on an adult size sock. So as you come to the end of the second needle, knitting it onto the one needle, you will turn your work because you're going to work flat from this point on. And at this point you have half of your stitches on this one needle, and then you have two more needles worth of stitches. They are your instep stitches, and they are not worked at all while you're working the heel flap. You essentially just leave them as they are and ignore them completely, and that's very important. So what we're going to do now is, because the heel flap is worked stocking stitch flat, you're going to purl back. However, just before you begin to do the next purl row, I have a suggestion that you place a marker after the first row of the flap that you have just worked, and it's an opening stitch marker, and the reason I do this is that it allows you to easily count the number of rows in the heel flap that you've worked. So I count mine on the bump side. Now some people count it on the other side using the V's, but I find it easier to tell where I've got my little ridges on the backs of my stitches. I find that easier to count. You can mark it on either side depending on which way you like to count your rows, but I find that this is just the most easy for me. So now I've placed it there, and that's kind of, it allows me then to count the rows in my flap, which I find is useful. So once you've done that, you are now ready to work. So you take your yarn, and the first stitch is slipped purlwise, so going into the stitch purlwise with the yarn in front because you are about to purl the next stitch. And the reason that that's important is because that stitch, your slip stitches, will be used later on as part of your gusset pickup to create a really defined line for picking up those stitches. You'll see it later, we'll cover it when we get to that point, but for now just remember that, as it says in the pattern, you're going to slip stitch purlwise with the yarn in front when you're about to purl a row, and you're going to slip the stitch purlwise with the yarn at the back as you come to do your knit rows. Now as you'll see, I'm purling here. Again, that has to do with the stocking stitch being worked flat, so instead of working every round in the knit to get stocking stitch, you're going to be working a knit row and then a purl row to get the garter stitch effect when you're working that flat. So we're just going to come to the end of this row, and then again we're going to turn, and you can see that during this we didn't work anything on the other two needles at the back either. You just kind of get used to leaving those stitches on their own as well, so they're totally unworked. And now this time as well, after the marker, you see I now have two rows. So again you turn, and you're going to slip the stitch purlwise with the yarn at the back, ready to knit a stitch rather than purl it. And you can see the edge there, the edge is being formed of the slip stitches. Now there's one thing to note about heel flaps, is that sometimes they're reinforced with slip stitches across the knit rows where you're knitting and slipping stitches and then purling them as you return. There's different heel types, and those are reinforced heels. What I recommend is, before you knit a reinforced heel, make sure you're the sort of person who wears their socks out at the heel. It's not always necessary to reinforce, and sometimes it can affect the fit of the sock, particularly if you're wearing it in a shoe. So now we're going to work again. We're going to slip the stitch purlwise, and again you can see the slip stitches along the edge. They become more obvious as you go. So slip purlwise with the yarn in front, and then you're going to purl across this row. So you continue working the heel flap for the number of rows specified in the pattern, and that will correspond obviously to the size that you're making. It's a funny one with heel length is that there is a mathematical reason how it relates to the width of your foot, but you may find over time that you want to adjust the fit of your heels to make them shorter or longer depending on your own anatomy. But for now, follow the pattern. I'm going to be doing 18 rows in total because I'm following the first size, and then you can keep counting them, and you can see there how easy it is to count once you have your marker. And you can see that the heel flap is forming. That's why it's called a flap, because at the moment it's just flapping there on its own. So we'll just continue on now until I've knit the heel flap to the full size, and I'll show you the finished heel flap in a second. So we've come to the end and you have worked your heel flap. So the first thing I'm going to show you here is the slip stitches down both sides. You can see that they're quite obvious along the side. They would be less obvious if they were just ordinary stitches. We'll be using those a minute in the gusset pickup in day 4. So also here you can see I'm counting the rows as well, and I use the marker, so I have 18 rows, so 18 little bumpy ridges. And that's really useful, but it's also useful for another reason. Leave the marker in rather than taking it out, and you can tell how many stocking stitch rows you've done in your leg. And that's important because obviously socks come in pairs, and if you want them to match exactly, it's really useful to know how many rows you want to work in your leg. So it's really useful to leave that marker in, and you can count on this side as well if you prefer, but it's really useful to have that in as well. Once you finish your heel flap, you're ready to turn your heel. So the heel turn is worked at the bottom of the heel flap, which we finished yesterday. So you get ready to work, and again this is worked flat and not in the round. So the first thing you're going to do is knit in the number of stitches that it says in the pattern. In this case, because I'm following the smallest pattern in the DK pattern, it's 15 stitches is knit in of the 22 that I have on the needle. It's about 3/4 of the way across the heel flap, and this is because you're going to center the heel turn in the middle of the heel flap, starting on the left side. So I'm just going to do a quick check to see how many stitches I have. It's important that you get this right because you want it to be centered. So then once I've worked all the stitches, I'm going to do a slip, slip, knit, and I'm going to turn the work. And what you're doing is you're decreasing in along the side and kind of folding your heel over on itself by doing the short rows. Now they are not wrap and turn short rows, they are talk you through them as we go. We'll do the whole lot together. So that first one is a slip slip knit, and now you're going to turn the work. So you have 5 unworked stitches on the left hand side of your work, and that positions your heel turn in the middle of your heel flap. So you can see the 5 unworked stitches there. So you're going to turn and you're getting ready to work. Now you're going to slip the first stitch of this. You didn't in the first row of the turn, but you do in all of the other rows in the turn. So I'm going to slip this purlwise with yarn in front, ready to purl, and then I'm going to purl 8 stitches according to the pattern. It's important to work the right number of stitches here because again it is key that your heel turn is in the center of the flap, and I'm saying this again because it's somewhere where lots of people go wrong and you decrease down one side more than the other. So as soon as you're there, you are going to purl 2 stitches together, and that is your matching decrease to the slip slip knit on the other side. And that is, you can see then that you have 5 stitches unworked on this side as well, and that is another important point. So you will always know after you finish your purl row if you're right, because you should have the same number of unworked stitches on both sides. In this pattern anyway, and in a lot of patterns that are using a heel turn like this. So again, you're going to turn your work and work back. You're going to slip this stitch purlwise with the yarn in back because it's a knit stitch. Now, you're going to knit another 8 stitches as you did previously, but in some patterns that's not specified. What they say is to knit to 1 stitch before the gap. And that is just to tell you the difference that you may see in other patterns. And what you can see here is 1 stitch before the gap. You can see the gap is quite obvious, and that is the gap between the last worked stitch of your previous row and the 5 unworked stitches. And what you're doing here is you are bridging that gap by doing another slip slip knit, and these are the short rows. So that is how you make sure you have no holes in your short rows, is by slip slip knitting across them. Now again, you turn, you purl, slip purlwise, and then you purl 8, and again you're purling to 1 before the gap in this case. So again, if you see that in a pattern, that's what it means, the 1 stitch before the last worked and the unworked stitches. So you're going to purl the 2 of those together again, and again that bridges the gap in your turn. And now you'll see that you have 4 unworked stitches on the left and 4 unworked stitches on the right. and you can see that it is beginning to form your heel flap already. So again, you are going to slip this one purlwise with yarn in back, ready to knit, and knit across 8 or to 1 before the gap. So you slip, slip, knit those together. Now you have 3 unworked stitches, and then you're going to slip purlwise, purl across, then you're going to purl 2 together when you come to the one before the gap. And those are the short rows that you work for the heel. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the next. I'm going to go until I'm nearly finished, and I'll show you what you do on the last row just before you come to the gusset pickup and the end of the heel turn. You are now working the last knit row of your heel turn. You're coming up to the end stitch, and again you've knit your 8, 1 before the gap, and then you just slip, slip, knit as you've done previously. So you slip, slip, knit 2 together through the back loops, and that is how you've it done. I know you've turned the heel fully and you know it's worked because there's no more stitches to work, so you know you've come to the end of your heel turn, apologies, and then you work back same as you've done before, so slipping the first one purlwise, purling 8, and then you're going to purl the last 2 stitches together, and that completes your heel turn. So the key thing to look out for here is that it's in the center and that you work the unworked stitches at the same rate on both sides. And that's it. You are now ready to work your gusset pickup, which we will do in the next video tutorial.